Good morning and welcome to this third session in our Bloomsbury SET conference. Today's session is entitled Delivering Large-Scale Knowledge Exchange Programs. And we're going to have three speakers and then hopefully some lively discussion following that. We're going to look at a number of aspects around large-scale programs, particularly focusing on the Connecting Capability Fund that has been supported by Research England over the last 3 and a bit years. We have, as I said, three speakers. Our first speaker I'll introduce in a moment. Hopefully there'll be a variety of different talks, but our first talk will concentrate on some of the sort of wider lessons learned around large-scale KE programs, and then we'll go on to look at lessons from individual programs funded under the Connecting Capabilities Fund. Just a couple of words about the event today. So please put your questions in the chat for the speakers. Put those in at any time as we go forward, and we will try and pick those up as we go along and answer them after the three presentations. Just a few words then about the Connecting Capability Fund that funds the Bloomsbury SET and some of the other programs that we'll be talking about today. So Connecting Capability Fund was launched in 2017 with two calls. It funded 18 projects, large-scale projects, total value around about £87 million. So it's a very significant investment by Research England. The aim of that programme was to strengthen the contribution of English universities to productivity and economic growth. So it was tied in very closely with the industrial strategy launched in November 2017. And the aim of the programme was to enhance the effectiveness of the university knowledge base to deliver commercial and business applications and wider applications for the economy and society, so very much tied into government policy. In practice, many of the aspects that Research England focused on were hard intellectual property. So rather than softer outputs, they were looking for licensing and spin-out. The aim of the programme really was to build strategic collaborations in knowledge exchange and connect, as the title suggests, connect expertise and capability, both of universities and also universities with businesses, so that businesses could access a range of different university-based knowledge exchange offers and a critical mass of know-how at universities. So it was intended to incentivize the ability of universities to respond to new opportunities, to share expertise in knowledge exchange and commercialization, and to disseminate good practice across the university sector. All very laudable aims, I'm sure you will agree. So we'll be catching up in a few moments on how well some of those have been achieved. First of all, it's my great pleasure to introduce Thomas Coates Ulrichsen, who will give a presentation on building large, complex knowledge exchange programs to deliver value. And he's going to be talking to us from the University of Cambridge. Thomas is Director of the Policy Evidence Unit for University Commercialization and Innovation. Try saying that with your mouthful. So over to you, Thomas. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Ray, for the introduction. It's my pleasure to be here today to give this talk to you, as Ray said, on building large, complex KE programs to deliver value to the economy and society. Next slide, please. So what I really want to focus on today are kind of these kind of 3 or 4 things. I mean, I want to give you my take on what I see as some of the key emerging priorities, policy priorities, and what that might mean for knowledge exchange. Talk about some of the lessons that we seem to be emerging from an interim evaluation that was undertaken on the Connecting Capabilities Fund last year, and then talk about what we know about making large, complex KE programs work from some wider experiences, and then to think reflective about looking forward and where we might be going from here. Next slide, please. So as I've the last year, I think there's been a lot of activity in policy circles, a lot of documents being published, R&D roadmap, the integrated review, plan for growth. Now we've got the innovation strategy emerging, and there's a bit of public discussion around that as well. And looking at, so this is my take on what I see as some sort of key policy priorities becoming evident, and they really centre around three key themes. I think the first is around the UK's position in the world, the science and tech superpower by 2030, around levelling up and addressing long-standing socioeconomic regional disparities, and this includes through using R&D and innovation investments to help achieve that end. But then also raising the overall level of R&D and innovation in the economy and addressing the long-standing productivity challenges, and addressing sort of some of the sort of slightly worrying data that's emerging around perhaps declining innovation activity rates in the UK as well over the last few years. Now, when you look at the discussion around how we might deliver on these themes, I think a number of key sort of priorities seem to be emerging. The first is around the focus on mission-led, challenge-led programs to address societal and complex innovation challenges, on developing the ability to develop and commercialize emerging technologies to drive industries of the future. I'm noticing a much stronger discourse now, not just on research excellence, but also on the ability to translate R&D into applications, to commercialize outputs emerging from research. Also on workforce development, helping to support companies to innovate, to raise productivity and drive efficiency gains to be able to compete. Investing in the R&D and innovation infrastructure that underpins our ability to innovate. And that's not just about facilities and equipment, but our capability to innovate, the entrepreneurial capabilities, access to finance, the networks that are important for innovation as well. And then obviously with the sort of the levelling up and place agenda, an increased discussion about how we make some of these investments through a place-based lens. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to put up this section of the R&D roadmap, because I thought it sort of provoked an interesting thought. And it made the point that accelerating the journey between concept and commercial application is critical to realising the impact from the UK's world-class research. But a common concern with the UK innovation landscape is that while support is available for early-stage research and development, this falls away before ideas are commercialised and brought to market. And then it goes on to make, I think, what is a really important point for the UK, and not just for the UK, but also other countries as well. We're not unique in this space. That productive interaction between the business and academic communities is often impeded by a shortage of the relevant knowledge and skills in research, translation, and entrepreneurship. And that's something really important. I think that's where these CCF projects are actually playing a really important role to help address that issue in the UK, and as I said, in other countries as well. Next slide, please. So I've talked a bit about what I see as kind of key emerging policy priorities and how they might be delivered, and with particular interest in what that means for the university base. But I just want to reflect a little bit on how the pandemic has affected R&D active companies, has affected universities over the last year, since the onset of the pandemic in March 2020. And this comes from research that we did with NCUB last year, published in February, looking at how the pandemic affects these types of organizations. And I think, unsurprisingly, we found significant disruption to both universities and R&D active businesses, highly uneven effects across different sectors, university types, and things like that. But when we looked at the effects that it was having on businesses' collaborations with universities, and we looked at why they were changing the scale of interaction they were having, it was things like, that they were concerned about the ability to deliver value in the shorter term to their organizations, that was becoming an increasing priority for them. Needing to have stronger alignment between the activities they had with universities and their strategic business needs. And worryingly, for a sizable minority of the companies that responded to the survey, were looking to rationalise the number of universities they worked with. So, so I think there's interesting challenges coming along in terms of how, as a sector, we engage with externally to exchange knowledge and deliver value. When we looked at universities and how the strategic priorities of universities were changing through the pandemic and how they thought things might change as we move into the recovery, perhaps unsurprisingly, we find that the emphasis placed on the research portfolio and the strength of the research portfolio remains similar to pre-COVID. But where we saw much greater emphasis was around the importance being placed on challenge-driven programs and centres of excellence that integrate research and its further development into application, around the ability of universities to support companies to develop new innovations, to adopt the latest technologies to drive productivity and efficiency, and things like that. Working to convene and better connect organizations to innovate, the networks that are required, that we all know is so important. Build entrepreneurial and innovation capabilities and culture and strengthen the system within which innovation happens, whether that be locally or within specific sectors or around specific technologies. And evidence from our study, but also from sort of other papers and reports over the last few years, have really sort of started talking about the importance of building these multi-stakeholder, what you might call ecosystems and collaborations that can address critical challenges facing society and sectors and others. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to switch now to talking a bit about what are some of the benefits that are coming out of CCF, so focusing more specifically on CCF. And this was an interim review done by IP Pragmatics consultancy for Research England and published in February last year with an update in October. And obviously it's an interim review, it's not the final evaluation, but it does point to some interesting areas where benefits are emerging even sort of a few years into the program. They talk about the increase in commercial readiness, how the projects have led to the increase in commercial readiness of university ideas towards applications, stimulating spin-out activity and industrial engagement, training not just knowledge exchange professionals, but the academics and the students to make them more, to help build their capabilities to engage productively and effectively with partners, helping to increase access to finance in some of the cases to support early stage venturing, and supporting local ecosystems outside the Golden Triangle. It also found, I think, sort of really importantly, that there were benefits emerging from developing the critical mass around these key areas, whether it's through economies of scope and bringing together more of the necessary inputs to be able to make a difference, improving visibility to industrial partners, to policymakers, making it easier to access the university base by partners and things like that. They also found that it was helping to boost the profile of knowledge exchange within universities, that the scale of these things, the profile of these types of projects was having this effect on the overall profile of knowledge exchange within universities. And it was helping to increase collaborative activity between the partners beyond the CCF project. Again, the spillover benefits on wider collaborative activity. And importantly for the CCF, which was one of its key core aims, was about sharing effective practice and building a more effective approach to KE. They found evidence of a lot of sharing of effective practices between participating organizations, as well as a sharing of what the challenges are and ways of overcoming specific challenges in how they engage with partners, external partners. And crucially, what they also found was that the sharing of understanding, of approaches was not one way from, say, the large research-intensive universities to the smaller institutions, but it was very much everybody had something to contribute. Everybody had something to share in terms of learning. Next slide, please. We also talked about, and the review also looked at some of the challenges that these programs faced. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we all know that assembling large, complex collaborations takes time and effort. But it was time and effort and cost that perhaps the funding competitions don't always allow for. So for me, a big question is, how do we ensure that universities have the tools and the resources available to be able to invest in preparing the bids and assembling the collaborations to even go after these in response to the funding calls when they emerge? It also looked at the challenges around getting projects up and running. That also takes significant time and effort. And pointed out a number of difficulties, in particular around recruiting key staff. The role of director, the role of program manager, absolutely critical roles. And the challenges about competitions like CCF launching projects all at the same time can sometimes mean that you're competing maybe amongst the same pool of talent and making it hard to find the right staff. And recognizing that there is a shortage of well-trained, good quality knowledge exchange professionals who can take on these roles. They also point to the challenges around developing collaborative agreements between partners, and that can cause delays, and the importance of building that into the timeline for startup and implementation of the projects. Now, the next point is something that I've been coming across in a lot of conversations over the last year or so, and it really it focuses on, as we take research outputs into the translational space, it can sometimes require capabilities that maybe academics and knowledge exchange professionals don't have. And so the question becomes, how do we find the right people to do the translational work, not support the translational work, but do it? And that can be a challenge in terms of how do we bring them into the university on the right kind of employment contracts with the right incentives? How do we create a pool within the system of these kind of people that have, the right kind of incentives and career trajectories in front of them? It looked at the challenges around managing demand, and that can work in both directions, made obviously particularly challenging throughout the pandemic, both in terms of how do you generate sufficient demand when you're trying to engage with companies that may have not have a strong history of working with universities, such as SMEs, maybe cash poor, and things like that. But also in the other direction, in terms of how do you manage oversubscription, too much demand for the availability of the services you have on offer? How do you set expectations? How do you prioritize which investments to make? They also talked about the time to impact. We all know that it takes a long time for the impacts to be fully realized. But this leads to challenges about how do you demonstrate the value of these types of programs within the 3-year funding envelope that's available to secure future funding to become sustainable. And that becomes is a big challenge. Next slide, please. So just before I finish, I just want to touch on some wider evidence on what makes these types of large-scale collaborations work. And this comes from a big summit that was held in Oxford in 2019, a partnership between the University of Oxford and the University Industry Demonstration Partnership in the United States, brought together senior leaders from universities and businesses who have insight and engagement in a lot of their partnerships between universities, companies, and others. And one of the key things we looked at was how to build these consortia, these multi-partner consortium collaborations that involve different stakeholders. And these are the kind of things that emerge. The critical importance of having a shared vision that everybody's bought into, as it helps provide a touchstone for the partnership and the collaboration as it emerges and evolves. A clear understanding of the value proposition for each of the partners. What are the wins? Do we understand how each partner is benefiting from engaging, and is that clearly articulated and shared amongst the partners? Do we have realistic and aligned expectations about what is possible? It's really important to manage the expectations of what is possible in the timescales available. Then the importance of having demonstrable leadership commitment to consortium and collaboration. And the next one I think is really important, having clearly articulated and well thought through pathways to impact, pathways to realizing value. It's obviously not good enough just to do fantastic work within the partnership, but how is each of the partners going to take that and run with it and do something that contributes sort of value to their organization, to the wider economy and society? Importance of understanding partner capabilities, working practices, and also the constraints and limitations of each other in order to design an effective working practices and relationships for the project. We all know that trusted relationships are important at all levels, researchers, managers, leaders, but also the support functions of HR, finance, and other bits of the university and partners that need to be involved. Again, we all know that strong project management and governance is critical, and this needs to be budgeted for. This needs to be a dedicated role. It's often very hard to make it a part-time role of, say, the academic leading it. And then we talked about the importance of planning up front for getting going, for hitting the ground running. And also not just for getting the project up and running, so once the funding comes in, we can hit the ground running, but also how to keep the collaboration relevant, how to deal with disruptions. All of these need to be planned for and mechanisms developed for ensuring that you can provide avenues for doing that. And then critically, for me, there's a lot of evidence about the importance of the willingness and ability to adapt and refocus these kind of large-scale collaborations. As for example, as technologies develop, as priorities change, as the context changes, what's the willingness to change? How do we build those mechanisms in to adapt? Next slide, please. So I'll just leave you with a few, I think, key takeaways for me. I think that the key policy trends really point to the ability of universities to translate R&D outputs into innovative applications, to work proactively to support partners in becoming more innovative and productive, and to really work proactively to help build the capabilities and infrastructure of the local, whether it's the local ecosystem, the sectoral ecosystem, to create and capture value. Collaborative approaches like CCF, the kind of CCF projects that we've been seeing and others, I think really help to develop the critical mass in scale and scope, and also bring together key stakeholders that need to be involved in the research to innovation pathway. And these, I think, are becoming increasingly important. But we all know that making these kind of programs work is very difficult and requires a lot of effort. And again, I reiterate the point about the importance of willingness to experiment, learn, and then critically share experiences with the community, so the community as a whole can learn about what works and what doesn't work. Next slide, please. And I'll just leave you with one challenge for me. So I think as we enter a potentially tough spending review and a very potentially tough fiscal period, I think we need to be more proactive in helping policymakers and the wider public understand the importance of universities in driving innovation and economic prosperity. of the importance of knowledge exchange in creating the necessary pathways to impact, and of the importance of collaborations, large-scale collaborations, as a critical tool in building more effective approaches to engagement. And this is a challenge we're trying to face at my policy unit. It requires more robust and more compelling evidence. So I'll leave you with that, and next slide, please, and say thank you very much for the invitation to talk here, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks very much.
That's great. Thank you, Thomas, for that really interesting talk. Can I remind you, if you're watching and listening, please put your questions in the chat for Thomas. Some really interesting points there that I'm sure you'll want to comment on or ask questions about. So please pop those in the chat box as we go forward. That would be great. Thank you. Okay. Gosh, we're moving on at a swift pace this morning. So it's my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Kirsty Cochrane from the University of Essex. Kirsty is going to be speaking to us about, again, lessons learned from delivering large-scale KE programs, but in particular, the project in which she is director of. Kirsty is based at the University of Essex, where she's Deputy Director of Research Enterprise Services. Over to you, Kirsty. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. I just wanted to say good morning to everybody. And Thomas, I made quite a few notes when you were talking through your presentation, and I hope that I can mirror some of what you've said there and from the points that you highlighted, because a lot of it really did make me start to think about the points that you were making. So I'm going to start by talking about ERA, what it is. So ERA stands for Enabling Innovation, Research to Application, and our project started officially in April 2019, but officially it really kicked off in September 2018 when I was in post with a lot of the other staff on the project. So it is based around, so our consortium, I'll talk about that just now. Our consortium is based around the Eastern Arc. That's the Eastern Arc Research Consortium. So that's the universities of Essex, Kent and UEA. And we brought together a wider regional consortium. So we also have included in the ERA network, Norwich University of the Arts, the University of Suffolk, Writtle University College and Harlow College. So that's the entire consortium from ERA, but it was all based around the original Eastern Arc Research Consortium. The purpose of the ERA project was to increase productivity in the east of England. So we've got that real regional focus. Now, like back in 2018, we weren't talking about levelling up, I don't believe, but now we would say we're addressing the levelling up agenda. So increasing productivity in the east of England by engaging with businesses to access the academic expertise across our network to help these businesses to innovate and grow. And we did that based around three thematic areas. So our three themes are biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and digital creative. So we've got this consortium of 7 institutions. And when you talk about large and complex, Thomas, in your very first slide, large and complex, I feel the complexity coming out already. There's 7 institutions. We have 3 themes. And then when I start now to talk about how we did this, increasing the productivity in the region, you'll see that it's even more large and more complex. So we had 9 different touch points, and we can move on to the next slide because it'll help me describe that, if that's okay. 9 different touch points or interactions on how we were going to do this, increasing the productivity. To help businesses grow with us, help student startups produce more talent for the region, and we use this through a variety of different funding mechanisms. So you can see the outputs that I've got here on this slide, but we did that through, like I say, these 9 different funding streams, and they were R&D grants where we worked with businesses. We offered grants of up to £50,000 to work with one or more institution to help them solve a problem, to help them get a new product or service out into the market. We had innovation vouchers that were smaller scale, and that was up to £7,500 you could apply for funding for that. We offered innovation internships, and they were 85% funded. We also took a view to encourage more startups and spin-outs. So we also offered a proof of concept fund, and that was for the academic institutions to have the benefit there, with the aim of de-risking research projects that had the potential to be commercialised. And again, we offered funding of up to £40,000 for that. We had microfinance scheme, and that was where recent graduates and current students could apply for up to £3,000 to undertake to basically help them move their projects forward, progress their business idea. Then we also had the Enterprise Accelerator, and that was where all of the institutions, students got together over a weekend to learn more entrepreneurial skills, and they've been exceptionally popular and well attended. Then we also had the final three delivery mechanisms for the programme were based around iTeams, digital hubs and hothouses. And that was all about bringing together events or bespoke initiatives for each institution with a business, bringing together student teams, mixtures of student and academics, kind of like in a talent hub sort of consortium way, so that we were working with the businesses in the region around these themes to help them diversify their product offering. So I think these are the highlights that we pulled together last year. So ERA, complex and large scale. So we worked with 186 students. I think that figure could possibly go up now because we've had more activity happening. We've trained 183 university staff in commercialisation and knowledge exchange, and that's not just academic staff, that is professional services staff as well. Definite increases in knowledge exchange activity, engaged with 103 academics on business-focused projects, and that's across our whole consortium, and we did get engagement across our consortium. So the partners that were the non-Eastern Arc partners engaged in all of the activity. And then for our non-Eastern Arc partners, and they're not in receipt of HIFE, so they're in a really tricky position where they don't have the funding to enable them to have the staff to do the KE work. But we gave them the opportunity to have access to these funds to enable them to do the interesting KE activities. And I think for me, one of the biggest highlights is that we invested more than 2 million in the innovation projects in our region. So I think that we can really see how we are addressing some of these policy issues that Thomas has been talking about, and what we can see going forward. We directly supported 192 regional businesses. Again, I think that would be on the increase. So that was me trying to put out there, like, we are large, complex. I think we tick all the boxes for what the CCF was wanting to do. I'm not sure that there was a funding stream that we didn't put on, to be fair. So so managing all of that, we have certainly learned some lessons. So I think if we can move on to the next slide, I can talk about what some of these are. Lessons learned, a clear brief. I can't stress how many times in the first maybe 3 months that we were asked questions, and we kept on having to go back to saying, what is the purpose of our project? We are here to increase productivity. We're here to do it via these mechanisms. Is this going to help us do that? And that it was because we'd had that really clear brief and that really clear outline about what we were trying to do, not how we were doing it, but about what we were trying to do. That really helped us focus in on these 9 different activities that we ended up having available across the consortium. We kept on going back to what the founding principles were. The next thing that I wanted to talk about was how is this connecting the capabilities for every single intervention strand that we had. We did say to ourselves, are we going to connect the capabilities here? And from some of them, it was a no to that, and we were comfortable with that because where we did connect the capabilities, we really made that work. But for some of them, it would have been over contrived for us to do that, and we didn't see that was going to bring value. And again, it took us back to those founding principles. Are we going to be able to deliver what we said we were going to do? We definitely had team goals and shared motivation. I think I've already mentioned that there was about 20 staff employed on this project. It's a lot of people, all at different institutions, but we were really keen to make sure that we had that shared vision and shared motivation. And I've got down hard work, a lot of hard work. None of this stuff had been done before. None of it had been set up across institutions before. It was a lot of hard work to do that. And the way that we were set up, maybe if we could go on to the next slide, it will help me explain. So the way that we're structured, so we have a core team, the central directorate team based at the University of Essex, and that's got the director, programme manager, engagement officer and an administration person. And that core team was responsible for the entire delivery of the project. Then within each Eastern Arc institution, we had delivery teams. So they had a programme manager and then specific theme-led based knowledge exchange professionals and administration support. So, and that was at each of Essex, UEA and Kent. But the purpose of the central team was to really manage and drive the entire project. The purpose of the delivery teams was to understand the processes and make sure that all the processes and the business engagement and that we were receiving and working with the right types of businesses. And from my perspective, when I talk about working hard, the central team really, their purpose was to put on the big events, was to manage the communications that were coming out from the entire team and organise all the training events that were bespoke across the entire network. So for me, that was a really important lesson for us to learn. And then when we think about going forward, what we have learned from that, I mentioned the non-Eastern Arc partners earlier, and they don't have that dedicated support. So we were trying to support them because we wanted this to work for everybody. It wasn't just about Essex getting everything out of this project. It's a real collaboration, and the Eastern Arc partners were struggling without that support. So we tried to put in mechanisms to help them access the funding. The number and complexity of interventions, like I say, I would meet with colleagues, people like Bev, who's about to come up and speak, and others from across the CCF director sort of network. And by far, we had the most complex setup. So going forward, I'm not going to say we'd want to do less. We just want to streamline and make a bit more simple, so that but still getting the same impacts and generating the same outputs. We agreed that we had mechanisms that were fit for purpose. What we put in place really worked, and it enabled us to fund the high level, the really ambitious projects where it's given us a lot of opportunity to be able to talk about the great outputs. And one thing that might sound like it's not an important thing, but regular meetings and putting in the time and effort to get to know people in the first 6 months really made a difference for our project. So I think going forward, remembering all of these things is a really important points. If we want to move on to the next slide, so identifying best practice. So I think it's really important to say that as the director of the programme, I wanted us to have a one project approach and make sure that everybody had what are we trying to achieve? These are our KPIs. We all do this and we're going to do it together. That lovely picture that you see there was our very first ever network meeting. And that was, I can't even remember when it was. I want to say February 2019. And we're all in a room together. That's amazing. Now we're all in a Zoom room together. But actually, we were using Zoom before the whole pandemic kicked off. So for us, it wasn't super tricky to continue. And actually, we've still been able to maintain really good relationships. So I think that's a really important point for us. We would definitely use more of Zoom though going forward if we were doing it. I used to spend a lot of time travelling from Essex all the way up to UEA and down to Kent. Don't get me wrong, I love the roads, but being able to just speak on Zoom also has its advantages. So collaboration that facilitated cross-institutional and cross-disciplinary projects. We've got some great projects between the University of Essex and University of Suffolk, working with Suffolk Mind, Essex and UEA partnering to work with Bombora. And I would like to say that we're all as individual institutions, we're all competing to work with businesses in our region, but actually ERA was bringing everybody together to collaborate. So a business would approach us and we'd be like, do you know what, at Essex we can do X, but actually I think that at Kent they can also do Y to help you. So the businesses were really getting everything that they needed in one place, and it made it really easy for the business. We made the contracting really easy, the delivery was all well managed, so that the business really did come to that one front door to get what they needed from a knowledge exchange perspective. And I think that worked really well. We were sharing across the network, oh yeah, sorry, Kent, no, we don't have that capability, but actually the biotech lead at UEA was like, oh, we've got the perfect academic for this. And it was handed over. And without connecting the capabilities, without having the staff based within their institutions, and the delivery teams were based within their knowledge exchange teams, so they really understood the capabilities of the research base that they're based at. So I want to continue on to talk about sustainable development, if we can move on with the next slide. Thanks. So ERA has invested in the region so that we can support ourselves. I've got some headlines there. So 20 new products or services enabled by the connecting of our capabilities. We have, 28% of our interns, and this was that's a headline from last year, so it might have increased by now. 28% of our interns resulted in continuous employment. I think that's a brilliant opportunity for the students and the graduate talent that's coming out of the institutions in the east of England. We enabled just shy of 3 million in leverage funding. So that's projects where businesses and universities have gone on to get further funding to support the work that they started with ERA. And I'm that will be going up as we move forward, because projects are still progressing, etc., etc. Invested 1.5 million into the innovation projects, and the building the capacity and the commercialisation and skills across the mass of our knowledge exchange. It has been a learning curve for everybody, understanding how different institutions do things in different ways. And we didn't ever want to change processes, but everybody had to be aligned so that we could all work together. So I think that's added real value. And if we can just move on to my final slide, please. So the lovely map that I have here, somebody said to me in a meeting, it'd be really good to see where all these businesses are based. And it's like, oh, right, okay. I'll try and think of a way that we can do that. And this is how we do that. So my wonderful comms and engagement officer, she pulls together this map for all of our steering group meetings so that we can see how regional we are. But we did also work with some organisations that were outside of our region. As long as the benefit was coming back to our region, then we thought that was an acceptable use of our funds. We undertook an economic analysis. So for every £1 of funding that we invested, ERA generated another £3.65, and R&D grants contributed 36.6% to the GVA, and internships contributed 28.8% to those figures. So the investment in our region, you really can see that it's been identified and been enabled by the ERA programme. So I don't have a finishing slide, so I'm just going to stop there.
Okay, thank you, Kirsty, for that really interesting talk about ERA and some of its really interesting activities and really important impact in the region of the East of England. Great, well, we're running very nicely to time at the moment, so I'm going to hand over to our third speaker for this morning. Pleasure to introduce Dr. Bev Vaughan, who's Programme Director at UK Spine, based at the University of Oxford currently. and she's going to give us some reflections on UK spine. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray, and to all the panel who've made excellent points before me. So UK Spine comes at things from a different perspective, and I'd like to begin by telling you a little bit about who we are. So if we move on to my map, thank you very much, tech team. Who are the UK Spine? So whereas most connecting capability programs and programs generally find that their name stands for something, Spine stands for the fact that our founding institutes actually look like a spine on the map. So it doesn't stand for anything other than that. So if you imagine your spine and transpose it onto that map of the UK that you see on the right-hand side, where Kirsty talked about regional agendas and the levelling up agenda, I think I could describe UK Spine as levelling out. So it looks at connecting regional expertise across the United Kingdom. And if I could give a reflection there about what we would do, what we could do in the future with connecting capability as a fund, include the devolved nations and bring calls in harmony alongside Research England with, for example, the Scottish Funding Council. Our founding partners are up on the screen at the moment, plus our newest one. So our programme is led from the University of Oxford with a central KE team based there. We then have our other lead HEI partner, which is the University of Birmingham. And beyond the wall, the devolved nation wall, we have the University of Dundee and the drug discovery team, who are absolutely fantastic. In the southeast, we have the Francis Crick Institute, and in Manchester, we have the Medicines Discovery Catapult, one of the newer wave of catapults. And as we move forwards, we've welcomed a new partner in the consortium, which is Open Targets, who are based over at the Wellcome Sanger Centre Institute in Cambridge, Hinxton, and are part of EMBL EBI. And what we look at doing is sewing up the expertise, the knowledge, the capabilities, and the physical offering across these institutes to deliver expertise in drug discovery that goes from the earliest identification of a gene that may be of relevance through to the earliest stage of clinical trials, where we think about, what is it that we need to deliver in the clinic to show significance and to move to delivering a new drug or a new therapeutic. If we move on to the challenge that the UK Spine face, thank you very much. I'm trying not to say next slide every time. So our theme is one theme. So Kirsty very beautifully articulated the three themes that ERA have. What we have is one theme, which is that we were addressing the unmet need around healthy ageing. Thomas mentioned at the beginning the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. And one of the challenges that was set out was that the government would address how we age, looking to achieve 5 extra years of healthy life for every individual in the United Kingdom by 2035. This isn't something that we look at in isolation as an island. This is a global challenge. We'll have more people over 65 than under 65 in the next decade. And while we see lifespan extending, although we have more recently seen a plateau of that, we don't see health span extending by the same amount. And by health span, what do I mean? I mean the number of years we live in active, healthy life, the number of years we are able to contribute to economic and society gains. We see generally that health span shrinks in proportion to lifespan, particularly over the last decade. And what we want to see is that people live healthy, well lives as long as possible. Because as we age, before we acquire a full-blown disease, we often acquire underlying health conditions that impact our ability to remain in the workplace, to remain contributing to society. And because of that, there are things that we can do, and there are many things that we can do which are not new drugs. And so other CCF programs have had themes around healthy aging, where we look at how people remain within their living environment, within their homes, how we can have tech that supports this, how we can use apps to monitor sleep-wake cycles, movement about the house, for example. But what we have focused on is where can we introduce new therapeutic innovations, new drugs, or repurpose and use differently drugs that we already have. Why do we think that's important? Because if you keep people in the workforce, if you keep people in society, there are huge and tremendous gains. And if anything else, the last year in the pandemic has brought into utter sharp focus the need to actually achieve this goal. So there are many solutions that we can use, from an app on a phone for somebody who's beginning to show the early signs of Parkinson's to see how they move about their house, through to identifying the common and underlying biological themes and biological pathways that begin to go wrong as we age, and say, can we be more thoughtful about how we design for that? So the UK Spine I'm going to say, the next slide, set out to connect the capabilities and the knowledge across the UK in these themes, looking at new and novel targets for drugs, the expertise within groups such as the University of Oxford Centre for Medicines Discovery, the Dundee Drug Discovery Institute, and the Birmingham Health Partners, allows us to say, actually, here's some really good ideas of where one gene interacts with 3 pathways that might go on to form diabetes, other metabolic health conditions, just for an example. New clinical biomarkers. A biomarker, I recently saw in a workshop that I was in, can be one of 8 different criteria. Anything from something you collect on your phone in terms of the number of steps or your gait analysis, through to something which is a molecular marker assigned by a PCR test in a path lab. But we need these biomarkers to be able to understand when we're delivering new new therapeutics, that actually we're showing a response to them. And we have many drugs out there, and you will have heard stories around drugs for diabetes, such as metformin, for example, that actually we know have consequences which we call are off target. And so we can repurpose things that we already know are safe, that are affordable, that are easily accessible, and look at where they can give gains and improve that health span. So the UK Spine, if we look at our pipeline, meshes together a series of projects, from knowledge exchange projects that quite literally look at running workshops where we bring patients in the room with researchers, through to industry partnering days when we ask industry what's important to them, through to proof of concept projects which have been largely academically focused, where we say, here's an idea where we're looking at one of these core pillars of healthy aging. It's pretty high risk. How can we put some money into this to see whether this is a goer? And some of those have industry partners as well. Through to larger strategic flagship projects, where rather than being competitive and open the doors to all, we develop as a consortium projects that run now across all 6 partners to deliver this pipeline that you can see, from the earliest stage target selection through to something that might be commercially adopted. What have we learned with UK Spine? We've learned a huge amount, like all of the other CCFs. And what I've learned is that looking at healthy aging and looking at how we do drug discovery differently, how we deliver drugs that reduce the polypharmacy we see as we age, and that terrible thing that we hear from patients, that one patient might need 12 different outpatient appointments to address all of the underlying health conditions and sometimes the adverse consequences of the pharmacy that they're prescribed. That we can do things much better. And so our pipeline looks to sort of get across that. But what we found was many of these concepts were much earlier stage than perhaps we set out. We set out with a very grand vision statement, something that is of huge societal gain and importance. But what we found residing in these sort of silos of expertise needed much more early stage development than perhaps I would have expected coming into this. So I've got a couple of examples to really highlight these. So one of these is a project that has been done with the Medicines Discovery Catapult. So with the Catapult as a partner, what's fantastic is we can gather expertise from across our academic consortium and then point it to an organisation who has lots of expertise with connecting with the commercial environment and what we need to do. So John Overington's informatics team over at the Medicines Discovery Catapult have done this super project called Dream AI. And Dream AI stands for Drug Repositioning for Elderly and Multimorbid. And what it does is it pulls together multiple and very powerful data sources that are out there in databases across the world to look at drugs that have been approved and then look at what they can be, how they can be used in other ways, and particularly for aging interventions. And it allows the user to log in and say, look at aspirin, something we all know about, and then to ask questions about how will that be tolerated in an older adult who has underlying kidney problems, for example. Is it still safe to prescribe it in a model where that person has 5 other medicines? Here are the 5 other medicines. And it comes out with values and pulls the data together from these informatic sources. And so this is of use for people looking at how we can reposition and repurpose drugs, but also goes further than that into the pharmacies and the NHS practice of how we look at these things. One more example of how we've connected capability is the Committed Philanthropy project. Something completely different. So this is one of our knowledge exchange projects where we were approached by a group of, journalists and academics who had worked on a project in Sweden. So one of these journalists had been touched by a story around a rare cancer. And there was a drug that would have been perfect for treating a particular patient here. And they went on and fundraised because there was no funding to actually get this drug that needed a clinical trial through that clinical trial process. And they managed to fundraise for this in Sweden and run a small clinical trial via this model called Committed Philanthropy, where one sort of very well-off individual commits to actually allow this to come on board. And they approached us about, is this something that we could do in the UK? So, for example, if you've got a drug, one drug that we're looking at is bisphosphonates. We know it's good for osteoporosis. We know it's safe. We know it's cheap. But what we also know is it has effects that could help with those underlying conditions that we acquire as we age. But what we can't get is interest from the pharmaceutical sector to invest in a clinical trial around that, because there's no business model, there's no economic return, there's no financial return for them. So this group did a piece of work with the University of Warwick and LREC and REC research ethics councils to look at, could the model of committed philanthropy be accepted in the UK? How would it be accepted and processed for running these clinical trials? And that work, I hope, will pivot and allow forward work to actually look at a model such as bisphosphonates or another drug and fundraise to bring about a clinical trial. So if I move on, and I hope I'm doing okay for time, my final point about reflections of the UK spine and bringing this very complex, very large, and also very amorphous program together. They fall into 3 buckets. What I'd like to reflect on. There's problem solving, and that's everything from, we have this big vision, we've won this beautifully large award to deliver it, but how are we physically going to do that? Through to people and place. Our network is very dispersed. in reverse to Kirsty's. And operationally, how does that work? And actually, Kirsty's point about doing everything on Zoom, if anything else, the COVID pandemic brought the network closer together. Certainly in the beginning of the first lockdown, because we all worked together almost as one. It didn't matter where we were physically sat. And community. So wider tendrils into public engagement. What do the public actually want? You know, nobody wants to take more drugs, but how do you communicate the message and get their input into these projects? How do you get business pull through, knowing that actually I've seen over the last 2.5, 3 years, the tide begin to change, but the business model still doesn't work. So you need to get pull from those companies that will essentially commercialize and adopt. And it comes back to Thomas's point about needing a core of translationally focused people who aren't naturally perhaps the academic inventor of new ideas. So I'd like to finish on my reflections, which are very similar to some that you've heard already this morning. These programs need utterly strong academic leadership. And for ours, we started from an utter standstill and a great concept to then translate that great concept into a connecting capability fund where we now have 40 projects and many of those run across institutes. You actually need a very strong KE team to actually make that work and make the glue. And you need to be, as Kirsty said, you have to have one very clear vision. I would say I arrived 6 months into this project and we didn't have one clear voice and one clear mission. We had about 6 and we needed to come back on message. And you need to adapt. You need to adapt to situations. COVID hit us hard. We had clinical programs and laboratory programs that were hit really, really hard. And we needed to look fairly quickly at what we could do to support them. But we did it. And by God, it takes resilience. And I'll utter Kirsty's sentiment, hard work. And at that point, I'll leave with the point of success. How do you measure it? How do you capture it? And how do you sustain it? And I'll hand back over to Ray.
Thank you, Bev, for that really interesting talk. I see there's a small number of questions coming in. Please do put your questions into the chat because we'll be using those as a basis for our discussion that's to follow in a few moments. So please put the questions in, whether they're for one person or anyone from the 3 speakers that have given talks this morning. They'd be very pleased to address those questions. I'm going to start by talking about, I think, a topic that's sort of come up frequently in these discussions, really, and that's that this is really the Connecting Capability Fund program has been, if you like, a giant experiment in knowledge exchange, in coordinating and connecting capability and knowledge exchange. And crazily, Research England thought it was wise to give, nearly £90 million worth of funding to research offices, knowledge exchange, tech transfer offices to lead these programs. So that for the first time, we, as in people in research offices or tech transfer offices, have been at the forefront of the driving seat of these programs. And I just wondered whether our speakers this morning had any thoughts on what it feels like to be the rabbit in the headlights, if you like. Some people may have been in post at the beginning of their program, others may have been recruited some way through, as we've heard. So maybe you have different perspectives on that. Would anyone like to volunteer some thoughts? Kirsty.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I was at the University of Essex when the bid went in. I wasn't really part of the bid writing process or anything, so I knew about it when it started, and then I applied to be the ERA director when we knew that we were successful with the bid. So I kind of had an awareness of the programme. and what the outputs and impacts were expected to be. But I know that, like, for instance, Beverly, you were new to your institution as well, so I already had really inherent knowledge of how things worked at Essex and from like previous employment in other institutions. So I really knew how that worked, and I think that was really advantageous to me. But I didn't know how it worked at the other institutions, so at UEA in Kent. So that was a learning curve to understand how they functioned and how we could make all this all work together and kind of glue together and give ourselves coherent processes and practices that would make sure that businesses were getting a similar offer regardless of which institution they met with first. So that was something that I was really keen to ensure, is that there was an ERA offer and every institution offered the same to the businesses that we worked with. I'm not sure if I've answered your actual question though, Ray. That's some insight anyway.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Bev, do you have any thoughts on that from your experiences? You're muted still.
Sorry, classic schoolgirl error. Remind me the beginning of the question again, Ray.
Well, I was talking about the fact that this was a giant experiment and putting crazy people like us in charge of multi-million-pound projects. And how did that feel for you, being in the driving seat of this activity? Or did you feel you were in the driving seat, in fact?
So I joined 6 months in of this big, crazy experiment. And what I would say is, what an experiment it's been. I didn't necessarily feel I was in the driving seat from day one, because my first task was to unify all the different narratives and the different voices and the expectations of the partners, you know, with such a big and hugely important challenge theme. Working out how you're actually going to deliver on that requires a very clear steer. And we've got there. We've definitely got there. What I would say, coming back to, I think it might have been a point that Thomas or yourself made earlier on, planning at the earliest stage as to how you're going to bring these projects to life with if you like, a ramping up of activity, particularly having the director and the cross-site governance structure set up very, very quickly is absolutely key to delivering the thought experiment. But also, I mean, for us, we were more academically focused than Kirsty's. And I think unifying the researcher voice and expectation is really, really important. And actually getting business pull through at the earliest stage really helps that. But you have to translate the languages. All of these different parts of the sectors have a slightly different language and an expectation of what success looks like. So I think CCF has been a giant experiment. And I hope that the metrics they collect at the end allow them to see just how diverse the success stories are, because they don't fall in that natural and very traditional logic model. There are many that are going to fall outside of that.
I think that's a really good point, that the outputs and outcomes from these projects are very different and very diverse. But I think it's important also to note that not all of the Connecting Capability Fund programs were starting from the same point. So some of them were building on perhaps relatively mature knowledge exchange ecosystems, whereas others, so I'm thinking here in particular of the program that I lead with my colleagues at the Bloomsbury Set. We really had to build something from nothing, from scratch, really, an ecosystem that didn't exist in 3 and a bit years. And that's obviously a difficult process, starting from a very low baseline in terms of those kind of connections and the kind of translational outputs that are demanded of these programs. Coming back to a point earlier that was made around recruiting teams and key people, I think Thomas made this point about recruiting key staff, and the fact that because of the timing of the original calls, we ended up effectively competing against one another for the same pool of talent. Well, in the we set, I'd already hoovered up the best talent from the start, so that kind of left everyone else for the rest of you guys and gals to bring on board. But that aside, how did you find that process in terms of how easy was it to get those key people in place? And I guess from the timing of the two of you, Kirsty and Bev, your arrival on the project indicates that you were sort of coming in some way already down the line in terms of the start line of the project.
Yeah. Oh, I'm not muted, I don't think, so I'm going to continue there. So yeah, staffing, that was it was a real challenge for us in the beginning. So once the directorate team was all in post, and we were in post around the August of 2018, but actually some of the other institutions had some of their delivery team in post, so there was kind of pockets of activity happening, and then it was really important to come in and as a director to start leading the programme and give it direction, give it some structure and communicate how we were going to do everything. I do think it really was an issue. There were some roles that we never actually managed to fill. So again, we had to adapt and be really flexible about how we were going to achieve our outcomes without the staff that we thought we were going to have in post. We really did struggle with that, and I think it's something that does need to be thought about. But what I will say is that now there's a lot more KE trained professionals, because we have had all of these CCF programs. Do you know what I mean? So going forward, we have a lot more highly trained, relevant, skilled people. So I would like to think that it wouldn't be so difficult again. But yes, it was an issue for us at ERA.
And now off mute. Yes, we had a similar challenge. I mean, like yourselves, Ray, we went from a standstill. Recruitment, although some roles got off the blocks fairly quickly in terms of we need these roles, the process was long and protracted. And I think, waiting for the relevant award letters to trigger the process and then to find the people. If I look back on it, did we reach the catchment of people most suited, or did they even exist at the time? We had lots of interviews with people who had the most unusual idea what a KE professional was and what the job would be, and fair play to them. So I think, recruitment, we didn't fill every role that we hoped to fill, but where we've had really good individuals, they've made such a difference. And I'd also echo the sentiment that it's important to have a core team who are perhaps central and belong in one place. But what we've had is a model where people are placed within different groups. So we have a contracts person who's within the research services, contracts and legals team, who has been absolutely fantastic and has drawn a lot of expertise, wider expertise from within that group. We had a target scout who was based within the drug discovery team in Dundee by the Scottish Funding Council Match, who brought a completely different spin and expertise to the group, but equally was absolutely integral to delivery. And the pandemic brought us all closer together. So even though the KE team that I looked after directly and indirectly, went from Oxford, Birmingham up to Dundee, working together with them in the pandemic became easier, but delivery of the scientific projects became harder.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up question to Kirsty and Bev on that point, actually, Ray? What types of roles do you struggle to fill? Because I think this is a really interesting question about how we build these kind of translational research projects and KE projects, and where are the challenges in recruitment?
From my side, it was the roles that, we had titles that were sort of not set in stone, but recommended to us. So when you put roles out that said KE manager or KE officer, they were the ones that really struggled. The roles around business partnership, perhaps because business partnership and business development is perhaps easier to articulate and actually get out via the right channels, we have more interest in those roles, certainly.
From the ERA perspective, we struggled particularly with our AI theme. So if you think about our geography, where we're positioned, the grades that we are able to offer, and such a specialist, we really struggle to recruit there. So I think it was a location and an experience. I think other organisations were able to offer a more compelling remuneration package for what we were doing. So I think that, but we did manage to turn around and make it work, because there was a lot of overlap between our digital creative theme and our AI theme. So the people that were in the digital creative post were able to step forward and manage those projects going forward. So that would be something that we would really consider about anything going forward, is because it's such a specialist role, but actually the people that were available in that market were all in well-paid jobs for large tech companies.
Okay, thanks. I think really interesting. I'm going to move on to ask some of the questions that are appearing in the chat. So if you got more questions, please keep them coming in, and we'll try and move through some of those next. There's a couple of questions which possibly I'll start with Thomas as addressed to, although I think anyone on the call can hopefully talk to these. But there's a couple of questions around the sort of size of the themes of some of the CCFs are really big. And there's perhaps a tendency to think that maybe as a result of this, universities are going to sort of save the world, save the economy. Certainly I'm wearing underpants on the outside of my trousers as part of a CCF program in that sort of superhero role. But Thomas, what sort of effect do you think that CCFs are having? Do you think is it a discernible effect on the sort of economic development or productivity, levelling up? These are all huge issues. What contribution do you think CCFs are actually making? Is it noticeable? Is it visible yet, or is it too early to say?
So I think just to start, I think we need to be a bit careful about setting expectations. I mean, universities are a critical actor, a critical part of helping to save the economy. They are not the only actor that will save the economy. So let's not set ourselves up to fail. I think that's the first really important point. We have universities, it's very important that we recognize the many ways through which universities contribute to all of these challenges, whether it's leveling up, whether it's innovation, whether it's raising productivity of SMEs. They contribute in different ways. They contribute in quite diverse ways, and it's not a simple kind of they create a technology and then get it out there and then that's it kind of thing. So that's one key point. I think where the evidence that seems to be emerging around CCF, and I wasn't involved in the evaluation, haven't worked with Bioinformatics, so I read their reports and studied some of the programs as well, is around, are we able to plug the gaps in that process of getting stuff out there, of building those partnerships, building those networks, which helps to generate the flow of knowledge, which will help to drive innovation, economic productivity, or help to solve some of these other issues. In assessing the impact of these programs down the line, when we come to the full evaluation and beyond, it's really important that you draw the boundaries correctly. So, are the CCF projects, the £90 million of money going to CCF, making a huge impact on national productivity? That might be harder to detect. Is it helping to affect change in the areas in which they're targeting their effects, in those regions or areas where they're targeting the effect? One would hope that we're starting to see discernible changes in the fullness of time, in sort of maybe 3 to 5 years beyond the programs. So I think we just need to be very careful about how we set the problem that we are aware of. These were £90 million projects. They're big, large scale in the grand scheme of things, but we need to be careful about where we draw the boundary of the effects of all these things.
So is the fact that these projects have been supported for 3 years, was just a little bit over 3 years, a limitation in terms of achieving impact? Because that's one concern I think that some people have, and it was mentioned in at least one of the talks, that 3 years is a very short time to be able to demonstrate outputs and outcomes that will really indicate, the sort of success of this work.
I agree. I think so. If you look in other countries, a lot of these kind of programs are 5 years. So in terms of their initial funding round, they are longer in duration. In the UK, we seem to have a lot of 3-year programs. As I think a lot of the people on the panel have talked, as Ray you've mentioned as well. It takes time to build up the projects to get running, and that can take a year. That can take a period of time till you're actually at full speed and generating the activities, which will then generate the impact. And so, how do we enable those to sustain themselves for enough period so that the impacts are properly flowing in some kind of steady state for a period of time before we can actually reassess whether they are working or not working or whatever. So I agree. I think it's a challenge, right? How do we make the funding programs longer in a tough fiscal environment? It's going to be a challenge, but we need to look at it, I think.
Okay, thank you. A couple of questions in the chat for Kirsty. So one of them is ERA has done a lot of different activities. How practical has that been to manage? And would you do it differently if you were to start again? And so that's part one. There's a similar question. Do you think this will help universities continue to work together on other projects? So have you sort of developed now the close links that would allow you to sustain those partnerships?
So I think to answer the first question, I think on one of my slides I had hard work in really bold letters, massive capitals. Yeah, like practically it was a challenge. But like I said, we had the central team in that, and that was their purpose. And when the bid was written, it was always envisaged that there would be a team there to do that hard work, and so that the delivery teams would be able to be going out and sourcing the businesses to enable us to deliver the knowledge exchange. That the central team, the directorate team, would be the one that would put in all the processes and the mechanisms to make it all work. Would I do anything differently? I think you always have to have the big ambition, and if the big ambition is delivered by having 9 funding streams, then you rock with that. If that's going to deliver it, if you can deliver the ambition with say 4 funding streams and make your life a bit easier, then yeah, I would roll with that too. But yeah, the complexity of it has made it entirely interesting, and one of the most energizing and varied roles that I've ever had. There's nothing quite like it. And to go on the point about like it was all brand new and there was just nobody else to ask apart from other people, like on the other people that were in a similar position. So I started reaching out quite early, like around the December time. So I made contact with Bev and I was like, how are you doing? How are you setting things up? How's it going for you? And we had a little group of us that were beginning to chat to each other, and it was really good to be able to talk through the issues that we're all facing. But we're all facing different issues, but then some of them were really similar. And the second question that's come through for me. So I think that the academics now have a greater understanding of each other at the institutions. So and the knowledge exchange professionals. So I think that we will be able to collaborate on knowledge exchange projects going forward, and I would hope to see that does continue. And I think we've already Beverly mentioned her contracts manager. My contracts manager, in some ways, has been the most important person in the whole ERA programme, because from the outset, like from our original collaboration agreement all the way through to the agreements that we have that's got quite a few parties in them, and making sure that we've all got acceptable terms. So we've kind of done a lot of hard work there. So we know what's acceptable to each other now. We know how to continue and to go forward. And Thomas mentioned a really important thing about trust. I think not only does a partnership take about a year to get set up, but also it takes a good year to 18 months to start trusting all of the institutions and making sure that we are all working again, to that shared vision, and that we all have that similar goal. So I think that the trust is there to enable us to be able to do these projects going forward. And I think there's an awareness, one of the academic expertise amongst the academics and of the KE professionals, about how we work with each other, but also about the academic expertise that's out there. So yeah, I think that we would be able to do it going forward.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. It picks up on another question which linked this in terms of did Research England offer any support for the networking of different CCF programs? And I think you've spoken there about making those connections for yourself rather than being prompted by Research England. So, I mean, to sort of answer that question, Research England did host 3 events during the last couple of years, albeit obviously with the pandemic, it wasn't possible to do anything during 2020. And those were they weren't explicitly network building events, but they were designed to get us all together in a room and eat some nice canapes and drink coffee together, which was quite helpful. But there was no kind of formal requirement for that connectivity outside of those events. So to a large extent, the connections we made were kind of either serendipitous or we went out and found like-minded people and started to talk to them and work with them. Okay, so another question from the audience is around academics having to adapt over the 3 years of the programme, and indeed us as the KE professionals or academics involved in managing these programmes. So this one's open to Bev, Kirsty. Did you see that sort of adaptation? Did you see some sort of evolution in the way that people approach the programme or engage with it over that time?
Yeah, so I mean, thank you very much, Ray. I can kick off with that. When we started, one of the thoughts that I had was, well, when we look at healthy ageing and geroscience as a sector, it's not something that's well established. And so many academics and clinicians are working within this space, but they don't brand themselves as being within this space. And the first year was very much about going out and scouting what was happening and what the opportunities were, and almost a piece of education. We see this as a national challenge. And from what we've got within our institutes, we know expertise resides within all of your groups, but we need you to start working together and to think about this as geroscience, as multimorbidity, as healthy aging, and how can your platform technologies, how can your clinical cohorts, how can they be used? How can you put novel and possibly high-risk projects together to address these challenges and think about what industry needs to adopt them? And that was quite a tall order. And so the first funding call, competitive funding call that we had was really tough because, people were saying, well, why should I be bothered about this? How do I work with this? And so there was a huge amount of network building, mission building, alliance building. And then what we've seen happen over time with the academics is that actually one stream, so our smaller proof of concept projects, during the pandemic, when we had that pause, when everybody was out of the lab, they couldn't get to their samples, they couldn't get to their flow cytometers or whatever, we started running some sessions where we asked people about what particular sets of samples they had, what particular tools they were using, what particular non-clinical models they were using, cell lines, animal models. And we got them together to talk about that. And that was so wonderful because when people started to go back into the lab, they started to exchange things. Could you run that sample on your assay platform, please? You've got that patient cohort that you work with. Is there any chance that we could do some cross-analysis of that? And so what we saw is we built a new community of practice around the healthy aging and the theme that we had. And then they were so on board, and it's led to other grant applications, partnerships with businesses where, particularly some of the Japanese pharmaceutical companies have got really strong interest in this, and they're reaching through saying, how can we work with you on this now? And those things are outside of the CCF program. They're outside of our specific projects that we might have primed and funded, but they've started to happen because of that. And so it's been a journey for them. We had some very, very much naysayers at the beginning. Why should I apply for this pot of money, this direct costs only? This is a small pot of money. You want me to work across institutes. And it takes hard work. Back to Kirsty's point, you can't put that big enough or bold enough.
No, absolutely. I think that would be reflected in all of the programs we've been involved in. And in fact, I think if other CCFs are listening in to this, or indeed anyone who's been running a large-scale knowledge exchange program would readily identify with that, it is quite exhausting. And particularly if it's something that you're trying to do alongside the day job, which has certainly been my experience. But as I said, fortunately, having a really good team behind you makes a big difference. I wonder what your thoughts are. Another question from the chat here around the sort of engagement of academics. Sometimes they sort of see things as a burden being involved in these programs, rather than, as Kirsty said, embracing the new opportunities. How do we sort of get them to value these things and balance them out with all the other demands on their time, do you think? Any thoughts?
Well, I don't mind starting a discussion on this one. So we've got some academics who have had a touch point with the ERA programme in so many different ways. Like, they've really embraced the fact that we've had this funding and this opportunity, so like proof of concept, and then they've gone on and worked with businesses in completely different projects. And I have to say that one of the surprises for me is, like, so at Essex, the psychology department has really engaged, and it's enabled a lot of knowledge exchange work to happen within that department. If you'd asked me, like, back in September 2018, what department is going to engage most with this, they would not have been at the top of my list. But it's really good because it's enabled us to have academics from different disciplines because of the thematic setup of ERA. We were offering a funding stream that wasn't really available anywhere through the digital creative theme. So it really has enabled different departments. And actually, our Department of History has brought in 2 knowledge exchange grants through ERA. And our Department of History, that is something that we are really proud to have knowledge exchange funding coming in with them, and that is all down to ERA and that specific digital creative theme. So I think academics that are in maybe the less traditional knowledge exchange heavy disciplines, we've given them an opportunity to engage in some ways, but I think it always comes back to being able to show the value of their work. Do you want to see your research getting out into the real world? And all it's about outlining the benefits of engaging in KE. And let's not kid ourselves that we don't know how busy the academic staff are. They have a lot on their plate, and we won't. I don't think every academic will ever. I don't think any institution will have every academic engaging in KE, but for the ones that do want to work in it, we will definitely support them with how they want to do that and help them get out of KE what they want. So,
okay, thank you. Bev, did you have any thoughts there?
I would just echo Kirsty's sentiments. We will never get, full participation. I think those that embrace it most are those that acknowledge that their idea or their invention may be passed on to someone else to make that next step, that next translational step. And that's a pretty hard idea to embrace. And for many, it's, sustaining a particular lab and group is looking for the new thing that keeps them, towards that more basic early TRL level of work. And so for CCF, part of the challenge is is to sort of pick up those things that are moving more towards a commercial product or a therapeutic discovery, and showing people what they'd need to do in order to engage with that, which isn't the day job. So you can't get everybody to do that.
Indeed. No, we're all very busy people. Okay, that's great. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. Could I have the final slide, please, as the saying goes? So our time sadly is drawing to a close, but you're all hungry and want your lunch or a cup of tea, so that's not necessarily a problem. So it just remains for me to thank the speakers in today's session, so Thomas, Kirsty and Bev. But also, if you tuned in to the earlier sessions this week, there's a list on the slide there of some of the speakers and compares for those sessions, and we're very grateful to all of them for the time they've committed to giving some really interesting talks. All of these will be available online via our website in a short period of time, so please come and look at the Bloomsbury SET website. You'll be able to capture the presentations there and listen to the recordings as many times as you want. So the final thing I'd like to say really is to the people who are behind the scenes today on this last day of our conference. So Sarah Rhodes, in particular, our fabulous program manager who's put this event together with Adalia De Paula, Knowledge Exchange Officer for the Bloomsbury SET, and my colleague Emma Tomlinson, who's the steering group chair for the Bloomsbury SET. All fabulous colleagues, all put in a huge amount of work to make this a great success and bring together some really interesting speakers and topics. It's just really interesting and a pleasure to be able to join up some of the CCFs this morning. We haven't had many opportunities to do that, to be honest, but I think by inviting one another to events like this, where we can talk about some of the shared experiences and shared learning, it is a really valuable experience. So, lunch. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I wish you a very good rest of the day. Thank you.